Azure Migrate. So today we'll be taking a look at the Azure Migrate service and taking a look at all of the things that it can do for you. So the Azure Migrate service is geared toward migrating your on-premise data center up into Azure. So this can be lift and shift migrations. It can be migrating databases that you have on-premise up into Azure PaaS services, such as Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Database Managed Instances. It can also be used for migrating web apps, migrating several different data types up into Azure, as well as things such as virtual desktop infrastructure that you may have running on um, Windows Remote Desktop Services or Citrix or some other platform. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we'll be focusing on migrating virtual machines from on-premise into Azure. So you see here on this first top entry screen, it supports Windows as well as Linux. So I'm going to just go and click on Assess and Migrate Servers. So a lot of this I have already pre-staged and pre-set up, so I won't go through every single steps, but I will talk about them. So when you initially come into this section here, all of this here may be blank. There may be nothing here at all. So you have to go through and actually select the assessment tools that you want to leverage. So in my case, I selected Microsoft Server Assessment Solution, which is free. But there are other third-party ones that are available that may have a price associated with them. So what you'll do, you'll add your assessment tool, and then you'll see a list of all of the available options. So as I mentioned, I've already selected the Microsoft option, so it's not listed in the list here. But if you haven't, that'll be a list in the list here. You'll simply click on the one that you want to use, and then you'll click Add Tool down at the bottom. So after you've chosen your server assessment tool, you need to go, depending on tool, there may be additional setups you need to do. So in the case of the Azure Migrate Server Assessment tool, you would go into Discover. And then there's option for Discover using an appliance, or you can import using the CSV, which is currently in preview. So for our purposes, we'll be using Discover using an appliance. So the first question it asks you is that, hey, are you using VMware? Are you using Hyper-V, or you're going to be migrating using not virtualized or other, which is currently in preview. So in my case, I'm actually virtualized using Hyper-V, so I'll say yes with Hyper-V, and then it gives me an option to download an appliance. So this appliance will come in VHD format. In the case of Hyper-V, it's about 12 gigabyte. An appliance is essentially a Windows Server virtual machine that has already been pre-configured with an application that will allow you to go and wire up that Azure Migrate appliance into the Azure Migrate service, connect it into your Azure subscription, and then configure it to talk to your various different hosts that you have, your Hyper-V hosts that you have on premise. So it can go and do assessment against your virtual machines, inventory, all of that, and send all that data back up to the portal and kind of keep that connection going back and forth over time on what's going on there. So I've already gone and done that. I've already deployed my appliance. I've already configured it. So I've done all of these steps here, and that data has already started flowing up into the Azure Migrate service in the portal. So we won't show any of that there here, but the process is pretty straightforward. You essentially download, spin up a VM using that VHD image, log into the system for the first time, and then after a few minutes, a web browser will pop up that'll walk you through the setup. So once your discovery process has completed and you start having data show up in these little bullets here, number of servers that has been discovered will show up here, and you can actually drill down into that data. So let's do that now. So you see I'm looking at my various different discovered servers that have been found in my environment, right? So I didn't add all of my hosts. I just kind of picked a few hosts and let it do its thing. And this is what I ended up with. So I'm seeing various different virtual machines. I'm seeing the virtual machine name. If the VM was running, I can see the IP address that was associated with it. We'll come back to applications discovered and dependencies. But over here on the right, we can see how many cores those VMs have, how much memory, how many disks, how much storage approximately it's using, and as well as the operating system that virtual machine is running on. So moving back to applications discovered. So today that's only supported if you're doing a VMware migration. But what that is that it will do assessment of the actual applications that are running within the virtual machines and actually pull that data back into here so you can kind of have an inventory of all of those applications. And then there's also a piece that you can do where it will leverage, I believe it's a feature of Azure Monitor, where essentially it will go and do a dependency map of the various different applications that that server is talking to. So for example, if say the application is a part of a 3-tip web app of some type, it'll kind of show that visually that, hey, this SQL server running on here is actually getting client connections from over here. It's going and doing some type of replication over here. You'll be able to see all that visually. And benefit of that is that, like, especially if you're migrating something from on-premise into the cloud, if it has other on-site dependencies, you may want to know of that because you may want to migrate those pieces in conjunction with the server you're migrating, or vice versa. Say if you want to leave, say, the database part on-premise and leave the application front end user space piece in Azure. The dependency agent-based piece will help you find those things. All right, so here we are. So we have our VMs, that initial assessment, or not assessment, but the initial discovery has occurred. So one thing you can do, I think it's optional, you can create group and group your systems in various different ways. So how that works, you'll say create group, you'll select your discovery source, and then you'll give the group a name. Let's say it's tests, and then you can go and filter. Like if you have hundreds or thousands of VMs that have been discovered, you can just go and filter down to just the ones you want. So in this case, I'm saying, hey, I just want the one that has SQL in the name. I get that list there. Then I can just go through, select the ones that I want, and oh, it doesn't like that name. All right, and then hit create. So I've already created some various different groups, so I don't actually want to create another one at this point, but that's how you'll go through and create a group. So let's hop back up to our Discover service. And then once you have your group, you can go and create an assessment. So if you say create assessment, same thing, you'll go and select either machines discovered from the Azure Migrate appliance or imported machines. You give the assessment name. And then you have assessment properties. So this is where you're going to find various different aspects of your migration. So like, what Azure region do you want the assessment to target? How do you want to size your virtual machines? Do you want to base the sizing on, hey, use the exact same size of the VM that it is on premise, or do you want it to kind of watch the VM, look at what its performance characteristics is, and then give you a suggestion based on the Azure VM sizes that are available in the region that you targeted? And then another option is that you can use something like reserve instances. So if you know your workload needs to run for 3 years, you can say, hey, I'm going to use reserve instances as opposed to like pay as you go, and you can get a pretty hefty discount as far as in the pricing for your workload as you migrate it up. So let's go and drill down into this a little bit deeper as far as the assessment properties and show you more. So in here you can see, as mentioned already, you can select your target location. So you simply click the drop down, select the Azure region where you want to go. So in my case, I want to go to East US. And then you have an option to select the storage type. So again, you can, if you leave it on automatic, it will try to match up with the performance characteristics of what it sees your on-premise systems doing with when it migrates. It'll try to match that up. So if it sees like, hey, you are using SSDs and NVMe drives on premise, it will try to match that up with either standard SSD or premium managed SSDs when it migrates up. Or say if you don't want to have premium SSDs or standard SSDs under consideration, you can hard code it and say, hey, I only want to use standard hard disk drives in all of my migration considerations. So you have that option there. I'll leave mine as automatic. And we already talked about reserve instances, so you can do either a 1 year or a 3 year or no reserve instances at all if you still want to, if you're not really sure on how long you want to run that workload up in the cloud. Or if you know that, hey, we're not going to need that for a full year, so we don't want to commit to 1 year of running this particular workload because maybe we only need it for like 3 months or whatever it may be. and I'll say no reserve instances. So as we talked about the VM size and performance, so you can do performance based, or hey, just match it exactly as it is on premise. So I recommend you normally do performance based. What it will do, so remember we have that I'm going to have that appliance that's on premise. That appliance on premise can talk to the various different Hyper-V hosts. It can pull in various different performance data and can provide that back into the platform here. So we can use that data to say, hey, this VM may have 16 cores defined for it on premise, but in reality, it maybe only really used 6 over a 1 day or a week period. So we can adjust the amount of performance history it'll watch or look at or take in consideration for its evaluation, and then make a educated guess based on that data that's collected. So let's say I'll just leave it at 1 day for now. Then you can say percentile utilization. You can select that. You have a few different options. And then you can select the VM size. So based on what's available in that region, you can have it go and do its assessment against all of those available VMs, and then it will give you a suggestion based on that, based on what it sees. Or say in your case, if like there's something particular about a particular VM size, and you know that ahead of time, and say, hey, we standardize on memory, only using memory optimized VM in your environment, you can say, hey, okay, just run that assessment only against the memory optimized SKUs that are available. And then we have comfort factor. So the way to think of comfort factor is to say, hey, if the assessment determined that, hey, this VM that we're migrating needs 4 cores, if you do a comfort factor of 1, it's going to have exactly 4 cores. But say if you move that to 2, what it's going to do is going to double the size of that VM from a compute capacity side, standpoint. So instead of offering you 4 cores, it's going to actually try to give you a VM that has 8 cores to give it that additional buffer. So you can adjust that. And if you hover over the information, it'll give you kind of probably a little bit better explanation of that than I just did, but that's essentially what it will do. I'm going to leave my comfort factors 1. And then down here, you select your various different pricing offerings. So if you are EA, you have an enterprise agreement with Azure, that'll show up here if it's part of your subscription, or you can do these various different pay-as-you-go offerings. Select your currency if you wanted to take any particular discount. So if you know you have some particular discount that's associated with your subscription, you can go ahead and type that discount in, and then when it does the pricing assessment, it will take that discount into consideration and then the numbers it provide back. And then finally over here on the right, you can say, okay, how many days per month is this virtual machine expected to run? How many hours per day is it expected to run? So if you know you only need this VM for 10 hours of the day and then you're going to shut it off, then you can have it take that into consideration when it does your assessment. Same for the number of days. If you know, hey, we only need this for the last week of the month, you can have it off for the rest of the week, and you can say, hey, we're only going to run this for 7 days out of the month. And take that into the pricing consideration when it does an assessment. So in the case of my workloads, or well, I'll say most of them, but a lot of my workloads, I need them to be running 24/7. So I'm going to leave everything there at the default. And down here, if you have like software assurance on your on-premise Windows Server licenses, you can say yes here, and that'll give you a little bit additional discount on the Windows Server licenses from the Azure perspective and the cost. So I'll say yes, and then you'll say save. So I'm not going to actually save this. I already have several assessments already set up, but that's essentially what you would do to set up your assessment. So, well, actually I will say save because I need to show you one other thing. So I'll say save here. That'll kick me back to the screen, right? And then once I'm here, you can either create a new group at this time or use an existing. I would just use an existing since I already created one. So I have this test SQL migration group that I have, and it already has several different servers in that particular group. So once you have that, you'll just go ahead and say create assessment. And I'll go ahead and create assessment for you. So I'll go ahead and do that. And now we're ready to go. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our top level screen here, Azure Migrate Servers. And then we have assessments. So you see here, I actually have 5 assessments that's part of this particular Azure Migrate project. So I'm going to go in assessments. I can go and select the assessment I just created. And you see here it says it's actually ready already to go. So looking at here is showing what is expecting my compute cost to be, what is expecting my storage cost to be based on what I selected. And then also it's showing like, hey, in my case, it's recommending like only standard hard drives. It didn't recommend any SSDs or premium storage based on what it's seen. And these dashboards, I can drill down into them. So looking at Azure readiness, none of my VMs says they're actually ready to go as they are right now with Azure. They're ready with conditions. So let's drive down into that and see what those conditions are. All right, so looking at VMs, we've seen a lot of them have these exclamation points that say unsupported boot type. So these virtual machines that I have running on premise, majority of these are V2 VMs, I want to say. V2 VMs, they're normally running like an EFI boot type, which is not supported in Azure. So it's just saying, hey, that boot type is not supported. So if I wanted to move this VM to Azure, I'll need to change the boot type. So one of the neat things about that is Azure Migrate actually can fully take care of that for you automatically through its integration with Azure Site Recovery. So let me just show you what it says. So let's drill down into the data here. So for this SQL VM, it has recommended a standard E2 V3 virtual machine. And then it's showing me the breakdown of storage versus compute for that VM. It's only $3 on the storage. So it's a pretty small disk on this particular VM. It's saying for unsupported boot type, it's saying suggestion use Azure Site Recovery that converts boot type during migration. So again, at migration time, Azure Migrate all by itself under the covers can fully integrate with Azure Site Recovery, leverage Site Recovery to do that conversion for me, and then also create the VM and stage it and do all of those steps for me automatically. So which is pretty cool in that regard. And then it'll give me some recommendations as far as what is seen on that VM. So this VM may be turned off right now. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what was running on there. It may be turned off, but it's saying, hey, one core is not using any CPU. Only had 4 GB of memory and is not using any memory. So that says to me that VM is actually off as far as the last time as has been assessing that. And the same thing with the disk, right? Typically when you run this assessment, you do want to have it on a VM that is actually running so it can get some more usable good data as far as what the workload of that VM looks like on a typical day or a typical week or typical month, depending on how long you let that run. And the same thing for the network throughput. Input and out, it would have some data there if that VM was actually running. So in the case of this VM, this size, right, and these things may not be exactly what it actually requires since the VM is actually off. So the data is not, it's stale data. So I would actually need to turn that VM on, have it run for a few days, let the appliance collect that data, send it up to the portal, performance assessment on it, and then give me a little bit better feedback on what's happening on that VM. So let's hop back up to top. Let's pick one of these that may be on right now. I'm not sure. Let's go check this one out. Okay, so this one looks a little bit better, right? So this one we can see it's recommended the same size, a little bit higher on the storage cost. What we can see is 4 cores. On average, it's using about 37.75% of the available CPU based on what the appliance that's seen coming from the host where this VM is running. Is at 4 GB of memory, but we see an anomaly here, right? We see memory utilization is more than 100%. So that's an indicator that that VM is actually using dynamic memory on premise. So when you're doing your sizing, you may want to take that into consideration and say, hey, that VM may be assigned 4 gig, but since dynamic memory is enabled, it actually can burst much higher than that based on however dynamic memory is configured. So in this case, it's 144% of that 4 gig is actually what it's actually using. So I may need like 8 gig or 16 gig or some other number based on that. And then also the size of the disk, so we're seeing how many IOPS it's doing on average per second. And so in Azure, I believe a standard hard drive is it can use up to 500 IOPS, I believe. So since I'm below that limit, right, as far as on average, what it's seeing, it recommended for me to just use standard disks. Those should be able to provide the performance characteristics that I need for this particular environment. But if those requirements or the assessment determined that the IOPS were much higher, I would have suggested a different disk type for that. And then also network. So if it saw a very high network throughput of like several gigabyte per second, right, there is a correlation between how much network throughput you have and the VM size. So if it would have seen some discrepancy, or well, not a discrepancy, but we saw some characteristic where I needed a particular amount of network throughput, it will give me a VM size that can handle that particular throughput. All right, so that's how all of that will work together. All right, so we have our groups, we have our assessment done, and now we can go to the next step. So I'm going to just hop back to the top level screen here. So our assessment piece is essentially done at this point. We have our groups, we have our assessments, we got our servers discovered, got our appliance deployed, and we're ready to go. The next part is we need to select a migration tool. So I've already gone through, I selected the Azure Migrate server migration tool as my default, but there are similarly like on the assessment part where there's third-party tools that you can use for assessment as opposed to using the built-in Azure Migrate one. You can select others. So there's no cost associated with the Azure Migrate server migration piece, but those other third parties may have a particular price associated with them. So I'll just go briefly show you some of those other migration tools that are currently integrated with Azure Migrate. So I'll just go down and click here. Click the button that says click here. And you see here there's 3 different options here. I don't know exactly what the pricing of these are. I've never used any of these, but essentially what you'll do on the screen, you'll click on the one you want and you'll click add tool. And then you can click here to see pricing information or learn more about that particular offering. All right, but I'm not going to do that. Let's just hop back to top screen. So once that happened, very similarly like how we had to do like a discover, you'll kind of do a discover process on the migration tool, and I'll say, hey, are these VMware? Are they Hyper-V? Is it not virtualized? Which one is it? And then it'll, based on what I select, it'll give me a few additional instruction steps that I need to do. So one, there is an Azure Site Recovery Provider that we'll need to download and install on our Hyper-V host. And then there's also a registration key file that you'll have to run or associate with that Hyper-V replication provider that will perform the plumbing to connect your Hyper-V host up into the Azure Migrate project, which in turn is connected to Azure Site Recovery and to facilitate that migration process. And then finally, like you'll register those Hyper-V hosts with the service so they can talk back and forth. So you can see here, I've already gone through that host process, but I won't show you how to do that here. But it's pretty straightforward. You install the software and you'll follow the wizard, provide it with the registration key, and then it'll go and register itself into the service. And then once that fully finishes, this part here will light up with the various different hosts that have been added. So right now, like I have 3 connected Hyper-V hosts that are wired up to the service. And then if it was VMware, it will be similarly. You say yes with VMware. You say if it's going to be agentless or agent-based. And then again, you'll go through and follow the instructions, depending on what you're doing. So, all right. So go ahead and cancel out of that. So once that's occurred, right, discovered servers will appear down here. Go into our discovered servers. We'll see a list of all of our servers that has been deployed or discovered. So this view looks very similar to what we saw on the other side as far as discovered servers, but there's additional option now of replicate, right? So when we're ready to actually replicate the data from on-premise up into Azure, we can kick off that process. So say if I go ahead and click replicate, again, it will give me a few questions. What type of virtualization? Is it VMware? Is it Hyper-V? Or is it not virtualized at all? So in my case, it's Hyper-V. I'll say next. I'll go through and it'll give me an option to go and select one of those assessments that we previously have done. It's a yes or no question. Do you want to use assessment or do you want to do it manually? I'll say yes. Then I'll go and select a group. So I've already made a test group, and then I'll select the assessment associated with that group. So you see this test group here actually has two assessments associated with it. One I created previously and the one we just did a few minutes ago. So I'll select the one we just did a few minutes ago. And then that'll give me a list of the VMs. So I can migrate all these VMs together, or I can just do them one at a time, like test them, or just to get the data up. You can kind of have flexibility on how you want to do that when you want to do it. So I'm just going to select one of these here. Let's do the SQL 2014 server. Say next. And then here I go and select the subscription that I want it to be associated with. So in my case, it's already hard-coded East US. So that's come from the settings we selected earlier as part of that assessment. We said we wanted to migrate it to East US. You select a resource group where you want it to go to. That's probably not the best place. That's for domain controllers, but I'll leave it there. That works. You select your replication storage account. You select your virtual network. So the virtual network would have to already be pre-created in that region that you're targeting in order for it to show in this drop down. So in my case, I have a virtual network called Lab East Core that has already been deployed, and it looks like it has 3 different subnets. So when I'm doing this migration, I can say which one of these subnets I want the VM to go into. So I'll just select my 100 subnet. And then we have the question for if we're eligible for Azure Hybrid benefit or not. I'll say yes. You confirm your subscription or confirm your eligibility. Let's say next. And now we have option to deploy. So you can see here, this is SQL 2014. It's the name of the VM. It will just populate the exact same thing for Azure VM name. So one thing to keep in mind about Azure VM names, periods I don't think are valid characters in the name. So this will actually probably will give an error when I try to save it, but let's validate that. I believe I'm going to get an error though. So then here it shows me the source VM size, so 4 cores and 2 gigs. So that's not entirely accurate. It's just pulling this data directly from the Hyper-V host. So the startup memory of that VM, I guess, is 2 gig, but it actually can grow to like 64 gig, I believe, for this one. And typically for SQL workloads, you don't want to use dynamic memory growth, but in my lab, I do allow dynamic memory growth. So for example, on this VM, as SQL Server starts up, that host will only have 2 gigs, but as SQL Server starts requesting more and more memory, we'll start seeing the amount of memory that this VM consumes grow. So it looks like the Azure VM size configurator may have noticed that, right? So you see it actually suggested that I use a 4-core 32 gigabyte of RAM as far as the size, even though the source VM is showing 2 gig, right? So it was smart enough to realize something was off. Like 2 gig didn't really make sense to it, so it suggested much more RAM than the source VM size, not taking consideration the dynamic memory part would have suggested. And then we say what OS type, in this case it's Windows, then which one is the OS disk. So it's seeing all of this. So I think my small VM disk 1 is my OS disk. Then we have an option for availability set. So one thing about the availability sets in this wizard, the availability set will have to already have been pre-created in the resource group that you're targeting the VM to go into. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to be migrating something that can benefit from availability sets, you have to create that availability set piece before you do this step. Otherwise, it won't be available in the drop down. So in my case, there's no availability sets configured in that particular resource group, so I have no options to actually do that. Other thing about when you're deploying virtual machines in Azure, you only can put it into availability set at deployment time. You can't go back later and say, hey, now I want this VM to be part of the availability set. It has to be done up front. Do plan for that if you have that requirement. And in just case if you don't know, like availability set, what it is from an Azure perspective, when that VM, say that particular workload has 3 servers that perform the same role. what you can do, you can say, hey, I want to deploy these VMs into availability set, and what that'll do, that'll ensure that when those VM deploy, they won't deploy within the same fault domain. And what that means is that, like if you have a server, yes, think of it, you have a rack of servers that's running all different type of things, all different type of customers, and your VM1 may go to rack 1, your VM2 may go to rack 2, your VM3 may go to rack 3, right? So in case of the whole rack 1 goes down, lose power, lose network connectivity, or whatever it may be, your other two VMs will be unaffected because they're being provided with like power and network and storage and other things on a totally isolated and separate um, resource. So that's when you definitely want to use availability sets. And it could be another region as well. So you have there's another capability where it can be between data centers within that same region, where if data center one in that region like just blows up, right? You'll have another VM running in the other data center totally unaffected. All right, so that's enough about availability set. All right, so let's go X. And yeah, it's expected. It doesn't like the periods, I believe. So all the periods, so maybe I'll change those to dashes. Dashes should be okay. Say next. And then it's asking me about the disk. Like, do I want to replicate all of this or not? So I have an option there. So you can go and select just the disk you want to replicate. So obviously you need the OS disk, but say if you're just doing a test, maybe you just want to replicate the OS disk and not bring the data disks over necessarily. For real world tests, it's probably not the best thing to do, or unless you're going to be moving this data over in another fashion, you may not want to replicate it. But I'm going to just leave all selected. You say next, and then we can say replicate. So once I click that replicate, a lot of things are actually going to happen. So it's going to go and create that job. It's going to connect back over into my Hyper-V host on premise and wire it up with Azure Site Recovery, and then actually start that initial replication, sending that data back up to Azure. So that's gonna, I'm gonna go ahead and click replicate. That'll kick off the job to go and do that. So I'm gonna hop back over to Azure Migrate servers, and then if I go down here, so once this update replicating servers will say, hey, there's one server that's replicating right now. I'll be able to track that progress as it goes. Let's go to overview here. Go over to replicating machines. So we see that SQL 2014, the protection is starting to enable. It hasn't fully started yet, but it's starting to go. And like I said, it'll like go and create the VM, replicate all the data up, and then once it's fully up there, I can actually migrate that VM. So this you don't have to turn off your on-premise VM while it's running. It replicates in real time while that workload is running, and then as the changes happening on those disks on the VM, it will detect those and replicate that data up. It will keep streaming that data up until you're ready to do the migration. So if I go once I go to migrate, well, I can't do a migration right now, but once that save that data did finish, I can do a migrate and then do a test migration. A test migration, what that will do, it will go ahead and create a brand new VM and actually turn that VM on in Azure on whatever network I specify. And then at that time, they give me time to go and test that VM, make sure everything looks okay, make sure I can connect to it. In the case if it has some communication that it needs to do from on-premise back up into Azure, you can go ahead and at that time test all of that. And then once you're fully comfortable with that, with all that testing, you can actually have it go and completely destroy that test system and delete it off. And then when you're ready to actually perform the real migration, you can do that as well. So you'll that'll be simply, you'll say migrate. You'll have a list of objects down here that's ready for migration, and then you can say, hey, do you want to shut down that machine before migration? So that'll go connect to your Hyper-V host, turn that virtual machine off on premise, and then perform the failover to the copy of that VM that's sitting up in Azure already. So at that point, it won't take very long for that because the data is already sitting in Azure. It'll just spin up the VM, connect it to the appropriate storage, provide its appropriate configuration, and boot it up, and then you're off and going. So it works pretty slick in that regard. So you can see in my environment, I actually have already deployed or migrated 2 systems fully over. So this is kind of what it'll look like once the VM has fully actually migrated over, right? I'll see my plan failover finished. Actually happened a few days ago. There was no issues with it. It last synchronized again several days ago, and you kind of just see all that data associated with it. Computer network settings, what it was on premise versus what it became once it migrated up to Azure. What subnet it went to. See, it was DHCP assigned. Everything is DHCP assigned in Azure. And yeah, so one note is telling me here that failback from Azure to on-premise is not supported for virtual machines running with managed disk. So in my case, I did use managed disk when I did the deployment, but if I had that as no, in the case if you did want to migrate back, you want to make sure that use managed disk is set to no. Otherwise, you won't be able to migrate back, since the concept of managed disks don't really exist in Hyper-V on-premise. It's another consideration to keep in mind if you're doing this migration. But hopefully this has been useful. Kind of a brief overview of how you can leverage Azure migration to migrate your on-premise virtual machines up into Azure in a pretty frictionless manner. It works pretty well. In my case, you do have to plan for these things, right? So as far as the networking capability, in the case of if there's a hybrid scenario for what you're doing, in my case it is. So in my case, I migrated certificate services up into Azure, but most of my domain controllers are still on premise. So in order for my certificate service to still work, it definitely has to still have a connection back to on-premise. So one of the things I needed to do is this virtual network. I need to make sure that, hey, it's connected back to my on-premise, and then they're routable in between each other. They don't have like overlapping IPs or anything like that in order for that to work. So the minute that this VM showed up in Azure, it can immediately know how to find a domain controller that's back on premise. So that all worked very well. My migration went flawlessly. Everything just worked once I did the migration. So hopefully this has been helpful for someone. And subscribe, tell others, give a like if you like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.